Today's number 6 most urgent vulnerability is CVE 2026-56164 in Microsoft SharePoint Server. And this is exactly why the Daily Ranked CVE Brief ranks by real exploitation signal, not just by the biggest CVSS number. On paper, this is a 5.3 medium. That does not sound dramatic. But it is listed in CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, and it sits at a high EPSS percentile, 0.92028. In plain English, this is a SharePoint issue where an unauthorized attacker can elevate privileges over the network because authentication is missing for a critical function. If SharePoint is part of your collaboration, document management, or internal workflow environment, this deserves fast triage, not panic, not guesswork, fast verification, vendor-guided remediation, and a focused review of suspicious access. The vulnerability is described by NVD as missing authentication for critical function in Microsoft Office SharePoint allows an unauthorized attacker to elevate privileges over a network. The weakness category is CVE-2026, which means the application exposes something important without properly requiring the user to prove who they are first. Think of it less like a password being guessed, and more like a protected door not checking badges at all when a certain function is reached. In SharePoint, that matters because the platform often holds sensitive business content, permissions, workflows, and collaboration data. The provided data does not name the exact component or affected versions, so defenders should avoid assumptions and use Microsoft's official advisory to determine exposure precisely. Verdict: the CVSS score is medium, but the access conditions are what make it operationally urgent. The two metrics that matter most here are network attack vector and no privileges required. Network attack vector means the vulnerable path can be reached remotely over a network, not only from a local console. No privileges required means the attacker does not need a valid account before attempting to reach the vulnerable function. The vector also indicates no user interaction is required, so this is not dependent on tricking someone into opening a file or clicking a link. The rated impact is limited to integrity, not confidentiality or availability, which is why the numeric score is not higher. But privilege elevation can still be a serious stepping stone inside a SharePoint environment. The most important fact in today's ranking is CISA KEV status. KEV means the vulnerability is in the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog. That is a different kind of signal than a theoretical severity score. It tells defenders this is not merely an interesting bug on paper. It has crossed the threshold into known exploitation. The EPSS percentile of 0.92028 adds another prioritization signal, placing it high relative to many other tracked vulnerabilities. For a security team with hundreds of patches competing for attention, that combination changes the conversation. You are not asking, is a 5.3 worth our time? You are asking, do we have SharePoint exposure to a known exploited, missing authentication flaw, and how quickly can we close it? Conceptually, the attack path is straightforward, but we will keep this defensive and non-operational. The CVSS vector says the flaw is network reachable, requires low attack complexity, requires no prior privileges, and requires no user interaction. That means a defender should assume the initial barrier is exposure, not social engineering, and not stolen credentials. If a vulnerable SharePoint server can be reached from an untrusted network segment, a partner network, a remote access path, or the public internet, the risk increases. The attacker's goal, according to the description, is elevation of privileges. That could affect the trust model around SharePoint actions and permissions. The exact vulnerable function is not provided here, so do not hunt for a guessed endpoint. Start by mapping reachability and confirming whether your deployed versions are covered by Microsoft's advisory. To check whether you are affected, begin with inventory. Identify every Microsoft SharePoint Server instance your organization operates, including production, staging, disaster recovery, and older systems that may still be reachable. Then compare each deployment against the official Microsoft guidance for CVE 2026-56164. Do not rely on memory, screenshots, or generic product assumptions. Exact affected versions and update guidance must come from the vendor advisory. Next, map exposure. Which SharePoint systems are internet-facing, which are reachable through VPN, partner connections, cloud connectors, or internal network segments with broad access. Finally, identify business owners and authentication boundaries. Because this is a missing authentication issue, The key question is not only whether the server exists, but whether untrusted users can reach the vulnerable surface. Your first action is to follow Microsoft's official remediation guidance for this CVE and apply the appropriate updates or mitigations as directed. Because the issue is KEV listed, treat this as a priority change window, not a routine backlog item. While remediation is being scheduled, reduce exposure wherever possible. Limit SharePoint access to trusted networks and required user populations. Review reverse proxy, firewall, VPN, and identity access rules to make sure SharePoint is not reachable more broadly than intended. Validate that administrative access is tightly controlled and that least privilege is enforced. None of these controls should be treated as a substitute for vendor remediation, but they can reduce risk during the window before full rollout. After patching, confirm the update state and document which systems were remediated. For detection, focus on behavior that does not fit your normal SharePoint access patterns. Review web access logs, SharePoint logs, identity logs, and network telemetry for unusual unauthenticated requests reaching SharePoint, especially from unfamiliar sources or segments that normally should not interact with the service. Watch for permission changes, role changes, unexpected administrative actions, or new access patterns that occur without a clear business reason. Establish what normal looks like: typical source networks, expected user groups, standard service accounts, and ordinary request volumes. Then look for deviations around vulnerable systems. Also review failed access attempts, followed by unusual successful activity, spikes in requests to SharePoint from untrusted locations, and any changes to site permissions or content access that cannot be tied to approved administration. To recap, CVE 2026-56164 is today's number 6 on our ranked list. It affects Microsoft SharePoint Server. It is a CVE-2026 missing authentication issue, and the official description says an unauthorized attacker can elevate privileges over a network. The CVSS score is 5.3 medium, but the practical priority is higher because it is in CISA KEV and has a high EPSS percentile. Your defensive checklist is simple: inventory SharePoint, verify affected versions through Microsoft's advisory, reduce unnecessary network exposure, apply the vendor remediation, and monitor for abnormal access or permission activity. This is the Daily Ranked CVE Brief, What to Patch First, ranked by real exploitation signal from CISA KEV, First EPSS, and CVSS. Subscribe for tomorrow's ranked breakdown, and check the full ranked report linked in the description.